Defying your husband, really, you are not fit for this. Do not interfere with my actions, you mere maid. My husband said something outrageous to me. While I was the one who really wanted to be angry, for some reason. He became furiously red-faced and trembled as he spoke. Living with him was filled with discomfort. Despite both of us working, he dumped all the household chores on me. He held patriarchal views and did nothing himself. Then, one day, an incident made my anger explode. And when I yelled at my husband, he lashed out in return. You should just quit your job and take care of the house. If you don't like it, let's get a divorce. He mocked me, saying such things with a laugh. It was clear he thought that by using the word divorce, I would obediently comply. But I would not be subdued by such words. Yeah, I understand, no need to say more, right? At my yeah, he expected me to be submissive. But the words that followed left him with a dumbfounded look. I packed my bags and left, heading straight to his workplace. I'm here to terminate the contract with your company. My words left my husband dumbstruck. My name is Kathy Brown, 42 years old. I like to think I've always been good at bringing people together since I was young. During my school years, I was almost always a class representative. And the comments section of my report card always mentioned my leadership. It didn't stop there, I also became the student council president. And there was nobody in the school who didn't know me. Kathy, you always bring the class together. It's really helpful to me. Yes. Leave it to me. I remember being smiled at kindly by a teacher and puffing up with pride. In college, there were no particular moments to lead, so I spent my time peacefully. After graduating, I studied abroad before joining my father's company. I devoted myself to work, improving my performance steadily. Day after day, it was a cycle of work and home. As a workaholic, I never had any romantic stories. As I entered my 30s, I started hearing more about friends getting married or having children. However, I never felt left behind or rushed to marry. Perhaps because of that, my dedication and effort at work were recognized, allowing me to work remotely for most tasks, leading a relatively free life. By the time I reached my 40s, I was the only one among my friends who wasn't married. Kathy, don't you have someone nice? Well, I've been all about work, so I haven't really had the chance to meet anyone. Then, I have someone I'd like you to meet. Would you like to see him? One day, a friend, perhaps pitying my lack of romance, introduced me to Edward, 3 years my senior. He, too, was a workaholic who had missed his chance to marry. With rimmed glasses, a pristine white shirt, and a suit that fit his physique. His appearance at our first meeting conveyed a serious demeanor. And I intuitively felt he was similar to me. It might be rude to say, but Edward seemed somewhat awkward, making me worry if our conversation would flow. However, that worry was unnecessary. Perhaps because our backgrounds were similar, our conversations progressed smoothly. And after several meals together, we started dating. Things fell into place quickly, and we got married a year after we started dating. Edward was incredibly stubborn. My initial worry that his stubbornness would lead to trouble if our values didn't align turned out to be spot on. His commitment to his work seemed to spill over into his personal life, where he didn't attempt to compromise with me. I want to have breakfast and dinner at set times. So, Kathy, I want you to adjust to that. Also, breakfast must always include toasted bread, bacon, and scrambled egg. Once we started living together, he brought up such lifestyle preferences. At first, it seemed like something I might be able to accommodate, but then he dropped a bombshell. Also, I want you to quit your job and dedicate yourself to the household. He had an old-fashioned patriarchal mindset, believing it natural for the husband to work and the wife to take care of the home. Moreover, holding a managerial position at work He seemed to take pride in that and was bothered by my working. But my job was essential to me. I can't do that. I want to continue working. Though he seemed to accept my firm rebuttal at first, he started looking down on my job afterward. Before we got married, we used to get excited talking about work. But now I couldn't even bring it up in front of Edward. As we spent more time living together, it wasn't just about work anymore. His attitude seemed to belittle me personally as well. Housework is the woman's job. I won't do it. He would insist on dumping all the housework on me, even during my busy periods. He would either be glued to his smartphone or absent-mindedly watching TV, which he hardly paid attention to. I have work too, so I wish you'd help out with the housework a bit. Even when I asked him nicely, knowing he'd be upset if I spoke harshly, he would just snort in derision and not lift a finger. Edward's parents shared his views, and every time I met them, they would make snide remarks. Kathy, you need to support Edward more. You're not acting like a proper wife. Yes, exactly. You're not fulfilling your role as a wife. I would nod vaguely to get through the moment, but stress was building up inside me. I thought about discussing things with Edward to find a middle ground. But he started coming home later, and we hardly saw each other. He insisted he was busy with work whenever I asked. There was no effort to make time for family. Could I really be happy living like this? Doubts began to grow inside me. It had been about 6 months since we got married. Edward's late-night returns had become the norm, and I had stopped bringing it up with him. One day, I received a phone call that left me speechless. My hands and feet went cold instantly. My father had collapsed. I rushed to the hospital. Naturally, I tried to contact Edward on the way, but he didn't respond to calls or messages. At such an anxious time, I wanted my husband by my side. Yet, why wasn't he answering? My mind went into a panic. With no callbacks or anything, I had no choice but to go alone. Upon arrival at the hospital, the attending doctor came to explain my father's condition. Your father has suffered an acute myocardial infarction, and we are currently doing our best to treat him. Will he make it? Although I tried to keep my voice down, I desperately pressed the doctor for answers. They were doing everything they could to save my father. All I could do was wait and hope for the best. Even though I understood this, I couldn't control my actions. He was too important to me, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. Unfortunately, despite their efforts, my father passed away. I wanted to believe it was all a dream, pinching my cheek, but the pain confirmed the harsh reality. I would never see my father's eyes open again or hear him call my name with his kind voice. His face, revealed from under the white sheet, seemed like that of a stranger. Although I had yet to accept my father's death internally, as his only daughter, I had to help my mother with the funeral arrangements and other necessary tasks. Time passed in a blur, and I hadn't even had the chance to properly mourn him. Edward didn't come to the funeral, did he? With her eyes swollen and red from crying, my mother uttered this in a daze. Yes, Edward had gone on a business trip instead, claiming his work was too important to miss the funeral. Even at such a time, it was all about his work. I was inwardly astounded. Even as someone who prides herself on her professionalism, I would immediately rush to the side of a family member or loved one in crisis. He had met my father during our marriage introductions, so why didn't he show up? I can't go because of work. After my father's death, when I finally managed to get in touch, all I received was a curt message. Was he not even a bit sorry? My anger flared. Edward only returned home after the funeral and the initial 7-day mourning period had ended. Moreover, he didn't even mention my father upon seeing me. Instead, he just asked about dinner as if nothing had happened. I clenched my fists so hard my nails could have pierced the skin. How could he act as if everything was normal? Doesn't he understand how I feel about losing my father? My thoughts spilled out in anger. What are you even saying at a time like this? More importantly, why didn't you come to the funeral? I called you multiple times before going to the hospital. Did you really not notice once? Edward seemed taken aback for a moment, but soon his face twisted in irritation. Being the patriarchal man he is, he couldn't stand his wife challenging him. Yet, I hadn't said anything wrong. The one being unreasonable was him. If it were your wife's father's funeral, you'd attend, wouldn't you? Even as I raised my voice, Edward just glared back, not really listening. Instead, he brought up something even more outrageous. More importantly, what about the inheritance? What? Inheritance? Is that what he cares about? His comment made it seem as though he belittled my father's death, which made my blood boil. I mean, about your father's inheritance. There is one, right? If you inherit something, that means I should get something too, right? What is he laughing at? The man before me was grinning, baring his teeth. His demeanor screamed of nothing but vulgarity. It made me wonder if he was even human. No normal person would miss their father-in-law's funeral or bring up inheritance while laughing. My patience snapped. Don't joke about this. How dare you say such a thing? You're the worst. I yelled louder than I ever had, the sound echoing throughout the house. I couldn't remain calm, glaring at Edward even after I finished speaking. I knew how this would affect his mood. But I wouldn't back down. I knew I was right. Edward's face turned beet red. He stood up from his chair, raising his fist as if to threaten me. It was clear he didn't intend to hit me, just to intimidate. But then he began to rage. Defying your husband, really, you are not fit for this. Do not interfere with my actions, you mere maid. It seemed Edward never really saw me as his wife. That's why he didn't attend my father's funeral and could so casually talk about inheritance, right? Such absurd logic made no sense. While I was the one who truly had a reason to be angry, Edward's fury reached its peak. His face turning a shade of red so dark it was almost black, his whole body shaking. His clenched teeth audibly grinding. Just quit your job and do the housework. If you don't like that, then let's get a divorce. Laughing through his nose, Edward mockingly raised his voice. It was clear he thought that by using the word divorce, I would obediently comply. He smirked menacingly, expecting me to apologize quickly. In contrast, my face went blank. I had been gaping in shock as he began to rage, but now my mouth was firmly shut. I was aware of how lifeless my gaze must have seemed. As if to epitomize what it means to have cold eyes. Yeah, I understand, no need to say more, right? Huh? What do you mean? At my, yeah, he seemed to have expected me to be submissive. And was taken aback by my words that followed, making a foolish face. What do I mean? You said it yourself. If I didn't like doing just the household chores, we should get a divorce. So, I'm saying let's go ahead with the divorce. Edward visibly panicked, his eyes darting around. His pride, however, must have prevented him from retracting his statement. Not that I would have forgiven him even if he had apologized. Well, of course. I've been wanting to divorce someone like you anyway. Hearing that, I lightly packed my bags and left the house. I didn't look back until I reached the front door. So I have no idea what expression he wore during those moments. I went back to my parents' house and made a certain call. The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. My eyes gleaming with determination and my face filled with resolve. I washed my face with cold water and slapped my cheeks lightly to psych myself up. Today, I was headed to a certain place. I checked my appearance in the full-length mirror when dressing, and once more pinched my face between my hands before leaving. Filled with vigor, I shouted, "I'm off," towards the inside of the house before stepping out. My destination was the company where Edward worked. It was housed in a grand building with many employees. Before entering, I looked up at the building from the outside, took a deep breath, and then moved forward. As I approached the reception, I heard a surprised voice from behind. "Ms. Brown. Is that you, Ms. Brown?" Turning around, I saw a familiar employee. This wasn't my first visit here, but usually, I would notify them in advance. This time, however, the visit was unexpected, so his eyes were wide in surprise. "I'll guide you immediately." Watching his back as he led the way, I smirked. I was determined to make Edward pay for what he had done, clenching my fist with renewed resolve. And then, I arrived at the president's office. The president, too, was visibly surprised by my sudden visit. I was asked to sit on the sofa inside, and after about several minutes, there was a light knock on the door. Come in." "Excuse me." Edward's voice was brighter than usual, oblivious to what was about to unfold. As he opened the door, he seemed to suppress a smile, but the moment he saw me, his expression turned to shock. He had been called back from field work. Thinking perhaps he was going to be praised for his sales performance, he had come eagerly. His attempt to restrain a grin faded instantly upon seeing me. "We have business with you." At those words, Edward narrowed his eyes behind his glasses, glaring at me coldly. "What do you want, and why are you here?" He seemed to have forgotten there were others in the room. Despite the president's presence, Edward began to speak rudely. "Why? Is a director of the parent company not allowed to visit a subsidiary?" "Huh? Parent company? And who's the director?" He repeated my words slowly, struggling to grasp the situation. He looked towards the president for help but, receiving no aid, began to fidget anxiously. In fact, I was a director at the parent company of the one Edward worked for. This company was one of its subsidiaries. After my father, the previous president, passed away, I took over his role. When I revealed this, Edward was momentarily taken aback, but quickly reverted to his defiant attitude. "So what? What do you want from me?" Despite being audible enough in a normal tone, he raised his voice, demanding an answer once more. "You're having an affair, aren't you? With a married woman at your workplace." "What? What makes you say that?" He tried to appear nonchalant, but his eyes darted around, unable to make direct eye contact with me. He became visibly restless, tapping his foot and scratching the back of his head, seemingly unable to keep still. Trying to pretend ignorance, was he? Well, I just had to present the evidence then. I operated my device and showed him footage from our home. Having suspected something was off, I had initiated an investigation into his activities. It was natural to grow suspicious after consecutive late nights. I had also caught wind of him lying about business trips to meet his affair partner. During my father's funeral, he was actually on an affair trip. He wasn't too busy with work to respond to my messages. He deliberately ignored them because he was preoccupied with his mistress. "You were inviting your mistress over when I was occasionally out of the house, weren't you?" The screen displayed Edward opening the front door to welcome a woman. Faced with undeniable proof, he was astounded. "If you wish, I can also show you pictures of you two in the nightlife district. What do you say?" When I asked this, he weakly shook his head, clearly understanding that I wasn't bluffing. Regretfully, I withdrew my hand from the envelope in my bag. I shifted my gaze from the silent Edward to the president, who stood there stiff as a board. He jerked his shoulders exaggeratedly when our eyes met. bracing himself for what was to come, his limbs tensing. "I will be terminating our contract with your company. Please, anything but that." Edward's affair was not the sole reason. This wasn't personal, I was concerned about potential damage to our business. Around the same time Edward's affair came to light, I learned that this subsidiary had botched a major contract, largely due to Edward's negligence in his duties. Continuing the contract under these circumstances presented no benefits. Hence my decision to terminate it. The president glared at Edward, filled with rage. It was clear he couldn't stand that a key employee had caused such problems. "Please, can't we make an exception? We'll hold the responsible party accountable." Emphasizing the responsible party, the president continued to ask. Edward stood frozen, unaware of the president's glaring at him. "I'll leave his discipline to you. I'll take my leave now." Without looking back, I left the president's office. A few steps into the corridor, I could hear the president's loud reprimand through the door. Later, Edward was demoted to a remote branch. A stark fall from his trajectory towards the executive suite. His pride shattered, he now works as a shell of his former self, unlikely to return to headquarters. He faced demands for compensation not only from me but also from his mistress's husband. I planned to demand compensation from the woman as well, though she held a position of responsibility. Her affair and subsequent demotion came to light after it was discovered she lied about work outings to go on dates with Edward during office hours. "Hey, did you hear? He was cheating with someone from the office? He dumped work on me before. Must have been to sneak off with her. That's the worst." Whispers like these became her daily reality. Despite feeling ostracized, she couldn't leave her job due to the compensation payments. Enduring pointed stares as she continued working. Wondering why Edward would engage in an affair, I sighed in disbelief. Such a concept was beyond my understanding and, frankly, not something I wished to comprehend. Shaking my head, I dismissed thoughts of him from my mind. For now, our only contact was for the ongoing compensation payments. But no messages or calls came through. I looked forward to a peaceful life without further entanglements with him. Indeed, I thrive when working. Though remote work has its perks, I resolved to be more active on site and dedicate myself further to my career.